from different locations. Those of us here in person are joining from Green College, where we're located at the UBC Vancouver campus, which sits on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. For those of us who are joining online, I'd like you to also take a moment to reflect upon the land on which you're located. And today we are here to explore the challenges and solutions relating to the climate emergency. And I think it is super important to recognise the ways in which climate impacts and mineral extraction can disproportionately affect Indigenous nations and other marginalised communities. As we aim to work towards a just transition, it's therefore critical that we work collaboratively and inclusively with Indigenous rights holders who have historically been too often excluded from decisions affecting their lands and livelihoods. Transitioning towards low carbon energy systems represents one of the greatest challenges of our time, and I deeply believe that it's going to require unparalleled collaboration among the best and brightest minds. I think at UBC we have a unique opportunity to lead in this area, and over the past several years I've been really privileged to be part of the Future Mineral Working Group, which is an interdisciplinary research cluster where we bring together academic researchers, Indigenous community leaders and industry professionals to reimagine the global mineral resource sector. Our cluster draws upon expertise in earth sciences, engineering, law, economics, and public policy, where we're working to drive technical innovation in mineral exploration and mining, while reimagining the environmental, social, and human rights dimensions of mineral resources in the context of Indigenous sovereignty. A subset of our members, including myself, Carol Liao, Philippe Tortel, Alison McFarlane, and Scott Dunbar, received a 2021 Killam Connection grant to create a new interdisciplinary graduate course, which is called Heavy Metal, Earth Minerals and the Future of Sustainable Societies. In that course, we're examining the scientific, economic, political, and social aspects of the mining life cycle, from mineral exploration and through to mine closure. This is allowing us to break down disciplinary silos among our graduate students as well. So it's not just within faculty that we need to work better together, but also across disciplines within our graduate program as well. So this event today is being organised as part of that course, and I really want to thank the students and colleagues in the course for the enriching and ongoing conversations. And I always say what a pleasure it is for me to come to the class and teach all of you every week. So I am really, really loving teaching this course this year. But I also want to recognise that reimagining mineral supply chains is not sufficient to address the grand challenges ahead. For this, we also need to think about how we can reduce our own mineral consumption here in the global north and to work towards more equitable and just societies globally. As we work towards that goal, I am really excited to be partnering with the UBC Centre for Climate Justice, and I really hope that this is going to be the start of many more future collaborations. I think it's a very exciting partnership. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jess Dempsey, who's an Associate Professor in the UBC Department of Geography, and she's going to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Nadia. It's so nice to see you all here. This is like one of those weird hybrid things that I think we need to get used to, right? Like we want to have somebody really cool come and give a talk, but we, maybe don't want them to fly all this way, and they also have time constraints. So bear with us. I'm sure there'll be some kind of glitch, yeah. So I am a professor in the Department of Geography, and I also have the pleasure of being the acting co-director of the Center for Climate Justice, which is a co-sponsor of this event. I'm just going to say a little bit about that. I know you all want to hear Thea, but I think the introduction will help introduce her too. The Center for Climate Justice, or what we call the CCJ, has been up and running for about a year now. And it's really composed of a fantastic group of UBC profs from across this campus, but also UBCO. And we span almost every faculty at UBC. I'm proud to say we have representation from arts, law, medicine, forestry, science, education, land and food systems, and applied science. Maybe you didn't know that there were that many faculties at UBC, but there is. And from departments as diverse as mechanical engineering, critical Indigenous studies, English planning, and my beloved geography, of course. And thank you. And that's just some of many. I'm lucky to co-direct it for now with Naomi Klein, and soon it will be co-directed by Candace Callison. At the CCJ, we recently adopted a collective mandate. I encourage you to check it out. I'm going to read a bit of it now because it relates to Thea's talk. So I'm going to read from our mandate, just a few sentences. The world is awash in crises: cost of living, war, infectious diseases, ecological decline, climate change, systemic racism, and gender-based violence, to name a few of many. At the CCJ, we recognize the interlocking nature of these crises and holds that treating them in isolation can often entrench and deepen existing inequalities and injustices. And so our work, therefore, illuminates the connections among common drivers of crises and supports responses that redress multiple crises at once. And in doing so, we work with movements, communities, and policymakers to develop research and analysis that is focused on the way that the post-fossil fuel age can open unprecedented opportunities for redistribution and reparations. This is a very big call, and we look forward to working with all of you to realize it. There's more in that mandate. Check it out on our website. But that approach is one that is fully demonstrated by our speaker today, Dr. Thea Riofrancos, who I have the pleasure of introducing. Dr. Riofrancos is an associate professor of political science at Providence College and currently an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. She's the author of a couple great books, including Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, which is on Duke University Press. She's the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. And through this research, really, Dr. Riofrancos exemplifies a climate justice approach in really helping us better understand the political and economic processes that so often tend towards extractivism. I regularly assign Thea's work in my classes because of her clarity and insight. She's also very active. Oh, of course, some kind of glitch. Oh, thank you. Naomi's always got my back. She's also very active in the climate policy sphere. I'm sure she's going to talk a little bit about it today. With the Climate and Community Project in the US, she recently released a compelling analysis really focused on the demand side of so-called transition or critical minerals, proposing that the harms of mining could be reduced by focusing less on individual car ownership and more on investments in public transit. And so here she's really proposing these kind of concrete, joined up approaches that are capable of addressing these interconnected challenges, in this case, decarbonizing transportation while also improving affordability and accessibility. So bringing together climate justice with something like transit justice. Thea is currently writing a new book titled Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, which is also the title of this talk. So that's the intro, and please welcome me in joining Thea on the screen. Thank you.
Hello. Sorry, that took me a moment to unmute and unvideo mute myself. Thank you so much for that extremely warm introduction and also for sharing a bit about what you all are up to at UBC. I think we'll see a lot of connections between the theme of my talk and the themes of the center. So I'm going to jump right into it because I want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. So just bear with me while I share my screen and we will start the talk. All right. I'm assuming that folks can see it. I can't really see the audience right now. So if there's any issue, technical or otherwise, just feel free to interrupt me. So I'm presenting a research on my in progress book project titled Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And we're going to go lots of places in this talk, the global north, the global south, across various nodes of the supply chain. And I hope that at least some of this content resonates with folks here. And yeah, it's really my pleasure to show you this in progress work. So let me start with where this all began. These are photographs and images from early on in my fieldwork for this project. So this dates to January 2019, when I first went to Chile and specifically to the Atacama Desert in northern Chile to begin to grapple with the contradictions and tensions and dilemmas of extraction that is related to the energy transition, right? So it's that kind of nexus of energy transition on the one hand and a resource extraction on the other hand that I sought to delve into in Chile, a place that I hadn't done research before previously, but in a region of Latin America where I've done a lot of work on resource extraction and the political economy of it and social and environmental conflicts around it. So I was interested in lithium as a specific sector that, as I said, kind of brings to the fore the dilemmas of expanding extraction in a world moving towards zero emissions. So this is where lithium extraction takes place in Chile, in the Atacama Desert. Chile is the #2 global producer of lithium, so it's a pretty important source of the world's lithium. And all of the lithium in Chile comes from the world's oldest and driest desert, the Atacama Desert. And so this gives you a slightly closer view of the Atacama Salt Flat, which is where all that lithium comes from, which is home to amazing endemic species like these Andean flamingos that we're looking at on the left that are snacking on smaller organisms in salty lagoons on the surface of the salt flat. Underneath the salt flat, which you have a better view of on the right, suspended in brine deposits is our lithium, right? So lithium is suspended in these underground brine deposits. It's sucked out of those and then arrayed on these enormous evaporation ponds, in which solar radiation does the work of evaporation. And what's left behind is more concentrated brine with lithium, which is then shipped off for further chemical processes and eventually ends up in our batteries. I also wanted to get a sense of the communities that are affected by lithium mining, which has a variety of concerning impacts, both on that biodiversity and the habitats that you saw on the salt flat and surrounding the salt flat, as well as on the broader hydrological system of what I already noted is the driest desert on Earth. So this gave me a sense of how other communities are using that same watershed and why it might be concerning that lithium alongside copper mining, alongside climate change, of course, is impacting the water that farming communities depend on. I began to learn, though, in the years that followed, that this is part of a much bigger story, right? Those specific landscapes are part of a global phenomena, which is increasing mining for the green technologies that are necessary to fight climate change and transition the world to a zero emissions renewable energy system. And so lithium is just one of a kind of periodic table of elements that are necessary to produce solar panels, wind turbines, and lithium ion batteries, which themselves have many other minerals in them besides lithium. And so why focused on lithium might be a question for those of us among us that are new to these topics. I just want to give a little bit of background on why lithium is important and the subject of my research. So one, despite the fact that lithium batteries have many materials, many raw materials in them, lithium is a particularly important one, hence the name lithium ion battery. It is non-substitutable in currently commercially viable lithium batteries. There are other battery technologies out there that don't use lithium, which I'm happy to talk about. But right now, the lithium ion battery is the prevailing form of energy storage. This energy storage is used in passenger ground transportation, so electric vehicles, electric buses, e-bikes, all of them have the lithium battery. So do larger lithium battery-based trucks, and of course, also grid-scale energy storage, which is necessary for to store energy on grids that have intermittent solar or wind. Lithium is a really interesting element, and I won't get too geeky on the geology front here, though I sense there might be some folks in the room that have that interest. It's found in a really heterogeneous array of deposits. So I already mentioned subsurface brine, which is where it comes from in Chile and Argentina and in South America. But also, for example, the one operating lithium mine in the US is also a similar brine deposit. There's also geothermal brine, where you can extract lithium potentially. This is kind of a in progress scientifically, and also generate geothermal energy at the same time. There's hard rock deposits, and there's also softer clay, lithium-bearing clay deposits. And it's found around the world, and it's actually a relatively abundant element. There's even lithium in the oceans, though in very low concentrations. But, as many people in this room know, the map of underlying deposits is very different than the map of actual extraction and production. And that production remains quite geographically concentrated in a few countries, Chile being one of them. The others are Australia, Argentina, and China. This kind of concentration of production is also part of the story of a growing supply and demand imbalance in which demand for lithium is rapidly outpacing market supplies. And I'll come back to that fact in a moment. I want to give us a sense in terms of that broader global story that I mentioned on how much we might expect the lithium sector to expand in coming years. So on the left, we have an image from the International Energy Agency from their 2021 landmark report on critical minerals, where they forecast that compared to 2020 levels, the size of the lithium market would need to grow 42 times, which is larger than any other increase for any of the other critical minerals that they looked at. And similarly, this is from Bloomberg on the right. We're seeing already big increases in lithium demand that are lithium supply having trouble keeping up with demand. And a lot of that demand is driven by, and if you can see the kind of small legend on the right, but that light blue is passenger vehicle demand. So more and more, the majority of lithium is demanded by the EV market and destined for batteries that will find their way into electric vehicles. I want to pause for a moment, and I want to address a question about how to think about this extraction of, quote, critical minerals in a broader kind of context of also thinking about fossil fuel extraction, right? So I want to address that head on because it's a question I often get, and I think it's a valid and a good faith question. So before we delve deeper into what the harms of this extraction are, what the novel policies around it are, I do want to acknowledge that it's absolutely true, and I take this from Hannah Ritchie from her Substack. It's absolutely true that fossil fuel extraction currently, this is from 2019, but roughly similar now, currently really outpaces the kind of volumes of extraction that we would see in a world that had zero fossil fuel extraction and was just extracting minerals to make the technologies so that we can harness renewable energy. And so I take this as a valid point, but I want to kind of underscore why I think this is not the most enlightening way to look at things, meaning it only tells us so much to compare side by side fossil fuel extraction and critical mineral extraction volumes. One is that these are not past and future worlds. They're all happening at once, meaning, as everyone in this room knows, we have continued and growing fossil fuel production. This has been a year of record profits and record output for fossil fuel companies, right? So we have a world of fossil fuel extraction alongside growing mining sectors in lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, and that's just a few of them, right? So these are not one time frame after another. They're simultaneous modes of extraction that are having shared and in some cases cumulative impacts on the earth. Another reason that, I think that this only tells us so much to think about it this way is that, each lithium mine, and I'll show you in a moment how many discrete lithium mines we're talking about, has its social and environmental harms, and those need to be addressed, even if we, of course, acknowledge that moving out of fossil fuels would reduce total volumes of extraction and mining and would also, of course, address the existential crisis of our time, the climate crisis. A third point, and this will become very clear throughout the talk, is that there's a whole really contentious and intense political economy emerging around critical mineral mining. That involves geopolitics, it involves protests, it involves new industrial policies that global North countries are experimenting with. So I think we'll be convinced by the end that despite the fact that in some future version of Earth, there would be hopefully zero fossil fuel mining, that we should still care about the impacts and the politics and the social conflicts surrounding critical minerals mining. So moving forward, how many mines are we talking about when we just look at lithium, right? Not at the whole periodic table of critical minerals, just looking at lithium. We have in the world currently around 40 lithium mines in operation, and that somewhat overstates it because really only some of those are major producers of lithium, and only some of those are are geared towards the battery market, which has very high quality grade specifications. But anyway, there are 40 and they're distributed in those countries mainly that I mentioned earlier, Australia, Chile, China, and Argentina, roughly in that order. In order to meet the needs for lithium in 2035, needs which are primarily, as I said, driven by the electric vehicle market, one forecasting agency, Benchmark Minerals, says that we'll need 59 to 74 new lithium mines, right? So that is a lot of new lithium mines on top of the 40 existing lithium mines, each of which has potential environmental and social impacts. But also, putting just those impacts aside for a moment, each of those takes a long time to build, right? So mines can take a decade, can take 15 years. One statistic is that lithium mines have taken an average of 16.5 years to come online. So the fact that we supposedly need this exact amount of mines in 2035, and 2035 is just over a decade away, and mines take that long to build, gives you a sense of the kind of supply crunch that we're potentially entering into. And I want to address that also, right away, which is to say we're already in a situation where supplies are not meeting demand. That could alleviate for a variety of reasons. So I'm not here to give you a doomsday talk that there'll never be enough lithium. And there certainly geologically is plenty of lithium. The question is, how fast is that available? How quickly do mines ramp up? And what is the gap between supply and demand? And right now we're seeing that there is a gap between supply and demand that's driving prices to historic highs. This graph on the left shows you prices up until September 2022, but they actually went higher, and November is now the record. They've settled a little bit since then, but are still higher than they were a year or two or three ago. So I also want to note that this price of lithium, or the cost of lithium, is important for a variety of reasons, but one is that it's starting to increase the cost of batteries. So that's on the right here. For decades, this chart begins in 2013, but for decades, even prior to that, the lithium battery prices have decreased over time, and that's due to economies of scale and manufacturing efficiencies and everything that makes goods cheaper under capitalism when more and more of them are produced. But as you can see, as we get into 2020, 2021, 2022, that price decrease has started to level off, and 2022 was the first time that they actually went up in price. And the main reason they went up in price was the cost of raw materials, the most important among them, lithium, right? So if we're thinking about the affordability of electric vehicles, the affordability of batteries for other purposes like grid storage, we also should care about the supply-demand imbalance, and think more critically about demand, right, and what's driving it. And I'll come back to that all the way at the end of the talk. So a bunch of interesting political questions are raised by this context that I just showed you, right? How many of those forecasted lithium mines will actually be built? What will be their impacts? How will these supply chains be structured? Who will benefit and who will pay the cost? And I don't just mean economic cost, but the social and environmental cost of these nascent supply chains. And are there alternatives to make these supply chains maximally just and sustainable? And so this is what I think about. These are the questions that come to mind when I think about the contentious, emergent political economy of green technologies. So when we think about the political economy of green technology mining, there are three sets of actors that I'm going to focus on today. One is governments, and I call that green statecraft, but the kind of green public policies that are related to building out these supply chains and specifically their mining nodes. We're going to look at firms, so both mining companies, but also auto and EV manufacturers, and what their role is in shaping these supply chains. And then we will look at social movements who are resisting what they call green extractivism in a variety of interesting ways, using new tactics and alliances. These three sets of actors, I think it's sort of clear to say, interact with one another, but they do so on asymmetric terms. Some of these are clearly more powerful actors, some are less powerful, but we'll see that even the less powerful actors are actually helping to shape how these supply chains are being built and who pays the costs and who benefits from them. I also want to acknowledge, though it won't be the main focus of my talk today, that also an actor here is non-human nature, right? So when we think about geological deposits, when we think about watersheds, when we think about habitats, these are also part of where mining is happening in the first place and what the impacts of mining are. And it's also interesting to note that in an increasingly unpredictable climate world, right, with extreme weather and increasing drought in some of the exact regions where mining takes place, the sort of climate and broader Earth system itself is having an impact on where mining is viable and what its impacts are. So I just want to pause for a moment and just note what all of this is based on. All of what I've said so far and the rest of the talk is based on kind of a long-term fieldwork project that began, as I said, in 2019 with my visit to Chile, but has also taken me to Brussels, to Nevada, to Spain and Portugal, where I'm looking at an increasingly complex and geographically expansive lithium frontier, as well as looking at some of the powerful political and economic actors that are helping to shape where that frontier unfolds. So I, also like to attend corporate conventions to understand corporate strategies and business models. I also like to attend activist gatherings online or in person, as they're now sort of taking place again. And I've done 120 or actually a little bit more interviews and a lot of archival and media analysis. So that's the kind of empirical basis of what I'll be presenting to you today. So now we'll get into my arguments a bit more. So I said that there are three sets of actors shaping this contentious political economy of green technology mining, and that the first is governments. And I start with governments because, as many of you know who study extractive sectors, the state has a really important role when we talk about resource extraction. These are materials that are found within states' territories, oftentimes to an extent within the jurisdiction of states. And states are important in green lighting extraction and regulating extraction, concessions and contracts, right? So states have a bigger role than they do in some other economic sectors. So I think it's a good idea to start with them. And let's look at what states are doing around the world. One of the really interesting things that I didn't predict in 2019 when I began this project, or in January 2019, but by the end of 2019, in December, when I was visiting the EU, just months before the pandemic came to Europe, I began to learn about, how the EU Commission was seeing critical minerals, not just in general, but mining critical minerals within Europe as key to their geoeconomic dominance, right? Then the Trump administration also picked up this language, and it's accelerated a lot under the Biden administration. I think we see parallels with the Trudeau administration, but just this idea that not only do we need to ensure access via trade to these minerals, but increasingly a trend among global North governments to want to mine them domestically or regionally in the case of the EU. So that's interesting. And that development is what broadened my study away from what I used to always work on, which was Latin America, and where this project started in Chile, and Chile is still central to the research. But I also now look at what global North states are doing because they've asserted themselves so intensely across these supply chains. And so, what I began to analyze first with my visit to the EU, and then over time with interviews with US officials and with corporations operating in both those jurisdictions, is something that I call the security sustainability nexus. And so again, this relates to what states are doing, especially in the global North, in order to dominate, as in their language, supply chains. And what the security sustainability nexus is, or in my coinage, is a set of policies and justifications that promote onshoring, or we might call it reshoring, because the US actually up till the mid-1990s was the world's top producer of lithium. It was a much smaller market then. So we could call it reshoring, we could call it onshoring, but regardless, a set of policies and justifications to promote lithium exploration and extraction in the US and EU, promoted, as we'll see, by an alliance of governments and firms. So what is the security sustainability nexus in a little bit more detail? It's a set of what I like to call corporate-friendly industrial policies. So these are industrial policies in that they involve the state trying to stimulate and develop a new sector, but they're corporate-friendly because we're not per se talking about public ownership or thinking about how society at large can benefit, but more thinking like, how can we incentivize these firms by making their operations more profitable and also de-risking them on the financial end. So corporate-friendly industrial policy looks like subsidies, direct public investment in what are ultimately private projects, forms of regulatory fast tracking to make the projects easier to get off the ground, and also helping the industry as a whole coordinate across the supply chain. What's interesting is that alongside these new industrial policies, we're also seeing state actors in the global north emphasize the importance of sustainable or responsible sourcing. This is often has a kind of geopolitical angle to it, as we'll see that, the idea that it's more responsible to do it in the quote West than in China or Latin America. But I think it's more than rhetoric because some policies are accompanying it. What we'll get into later is is there a contradiction between rapidly expanding these sectors and ensuring that they're sustainable? So we'll come back to this point. But this is the security side and then the sustainability side of the security sustainability nexus. And I want to kind of set up why this is an interesting development. Again, for those of us that haven't studied mining policy, though there's a lot of folks in the room that have, this should kind of be puzzling. Why are global north countries interested in moving mining into their jurisdictions? Of course, I'm speaking to Canada, to a room full of folks in Canada, and Canada is a mining powerhouse, for better or worse, depending on your perspective. So this might seem less novel in Canada, but it's very novel in the US and EU context, right? In both the US and the EU, for the past 50 to 100 years, mining has been progressively offshored to other places and imported, right? And so hard rock mining, has declined, and instead it's substituted with imports. That is kind of part and parcel of this neoliberal globalization story of really sprawling supply chains and just going where inputs are cheapest rather than seeking to territorially control them. It's also, puzzling because mining is low value added. When we look at the whole supply chain, it's the early part of the supply chain. We add value at every node. So it's not the most value add part of the supply chain. It also is socially contentious, can create political risks, is environmentally impactful. So why do the US and EU want to onshore so desperately and are putting so much public money behind it? I argue, as I kind of hinted, that there are two sets of reasons. One is on the policy end, and the concerns of policymakers over the perceived, quote, dominance of China over lithium battery supply chains. This is not, of course, total perception. Chinese companies have a major role in lithium battery supply chains, and China is the world's biggest importer of lithium and its biggest refiner and, of course, battery manufacturer. But seeing this in a geopolitical or geoeconomic lens as a form of dominance is what's new and noteworthy. This lens predates the pandemic, and in the paper that I'm referring to, I trace it over a decade, back into history, but it was greatly accelerated by the pandemic, by all the concerns about supply chain vulnerabilities that unfolded during the pandemic. And even more recently, it's been heightened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way that has scrambled the global economy, especially in terms of raw materials and commodities. And so policymakers are now increasingly concerned with territorial control over supply chains and including their mining node. The other side to this, though, is that as I said, this perception that mining is more sustainable in the global north or in the quote West, right? And we could get into policymakers' heads, like, are they really concerned about sustainability? Or perhaps, and I'm suggesting this here, and I got this out of some interviews, that sustainability itself has become a kind of brand. And there's this idea that maybe Western firms can outcompete their Chinese counterparts, not so much on cost or efficiency, but maybe on sustainability and ethics, right? And so there's this way in which sustainability has become an axis of geopolitical, but also geoeconomic competition. So that's the first set of reasons, what state actors are thinking. I said earlier, though, that the security sustainability nexus is a public-private alliance of sorts, right? So on the other side of that public-private divide, we see that auto firms and lithium mining companies are also very happy with this push to onshore, right? So for auto firms, it helps address supply shortages by incentivizing more mines to be opened in the global north. And for lithium mining companies, they're seeing direct lucrative incentives, right? So those subsidies that I mentioned, those tax breaks, those are going to lithium mining companies, and we'll see some examples in a moment. And so they are happy with this, right? And also both mining and auto firms benefit from the kind of reputational capital of this policy emphasis that mining is more sustainable in the global north. So what does this look like in terms of policies? I know that like a lot of this is too small to read, but that kind of shows the point, which is that there's been a lot of policy development. It's hard to get it all on one graphic. I'm sure that I've left things out, but this is just the EU and the US, and it just pertains to policymaking that seeks to onshore lithium mining, alongside, in some cases, other critical mineral mining. And it's a lot, right? We have executive orders, we have new laws, we have regulatory frameworks, we have the growth of new institutions, we have forms of public financing of research and development, and we're getting to the point, as my final row shows, of direct public financing of the mining sector. And I want to just flag the most recent news here, which is that the U.S. Department of Energy has loaned $700 million to an Australian company that is developing a mining project in Nevada, a lithium project in Nevada called Rhyolite Ridge. I'll also note that Rhyolite Ridge is caught in the crosshairs of some regulatory drama and environmental drama because the mine threatens a species of wildflower and would render it extinct. And so actually different environmental agencies have different opinions as to whether this mine should go forward at all. But meanwhile, the Department of Energy loaned the company, an Australian company, $700 million, right? So that just gives you a sense on how seriously and how much money is being put behind this onshoring push. And it's having real impacts, right? So all of this emphasis on onshoring and reshoring lithium mining is changing the map of where mining is taking place, or maybe more properly put, like will take place, right? Because knowing that mines take a while to develop, this is kind of more of a future map, but I like to show it nonetheless. And I'm taking this from my friend and someone I've interviewed a few times, Patrick Donnelly, who's at the Nevada Center for Biological Diversity. He's made this map. It's very hard to actually create mining maps before the mines get fully permitted, because you're kind of have to research lots of different, investor discussion boards and mining agency spreadsheets and so he's done a lot of work to compile this. And what he shows, this is just the Western United States, right? So it's just a handful of states in the West, is that there are 112 lithium mine projects at some stage of permitting or financing just in the Western states of the US. So 112 projects. They will not all go forward. Again, many folks in the room knowledgeable about the mining industry. Not every project actually comes online. Sometimes multiple projects get consolidated and bought by a bigger firm, right? But it's a lot. And that doesn't include, for example, projects being developed in North Carolina and elsewhere in the US. When we go to Europe, likewise, there are lots of projects at various levels of permitting and financing in Spain and Portugal and Germany, and close to the EU, or formerly in the EU, the United Kingdom, and then a close neighbor, Serbia. Serbia's mine was shut down by protest, but a lot of people think that with a change of government, it will probably be reproposed. And these sites will just continue to grow, as I mentioned, as more and more public money is put behind incentivizing onshoring of the lithium sector. But, this is just part of the story, as I mentioned, right? We want to keep our eye on the sort of planetary or global scale. So there's a lot of action in the global north in terms of incentivizing new mining. This is alongside global south governments that are discovering deposits and also drawing contracts and concessions with multinational firms. So recent huge discovery in India. There's been discoveries in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Afghanistan. There are current projects with contracts in Mexico and Brazil. And these are all new players, meaning these are not like our four, pre-existing. So there's expansion in the global south. And then there's also expansion in the main producers. Australia, Chile, Argentina, and China all have new projects being proposed, as well as intensification of output in existing projects to meet that soaring demand and incentivized by the really high prices for lithium, right? So our kind of big picture here, the way I'd summarize this map of extraction is that we have the continuity of what many scholars have called unequal ecological exchange, where you have raw materials flowing from the global south to the global north, with the impacts felt acutely in the global south and the profits and benefits of those felt more in the global north. But we also see, and I think we should grapple with the implications of this, an expanding extractive frontier within the global north as well as within the global south, right? So these are all pieces of a puzzle that's moving kind of quickly, and also opening up new opportunities for forms of protest, which I'll come to in a little bit. So the second set of actors is our green capitalist firms. So, now that we've seen what the state is doing, it'll, I think, kind of make sense what corporations are doing, because in a way there's a parallel, right? They too are especially the auto companies, very concerned with securing supply, just like states are concerned with supply chain security. And they also, as I mentioned before, are concerned with the reputational harms of mining, as well as the possible reputational benefits of global north mining under, quote, more responsible governance. So we see a lot of similarities across the public and private divide. In terms of the supply chain security end of this, we see a lot of interesting developments where auto companies are getting much more directly involved in mining. So jumping many nodes of the supply chain, the battery manufacturing, processing, refining, we see direct forms of integration of mines into auto firms. We also see long-term supply contracts, this race to secure supply or whatever is available on the market. The joint ventures between EV companies and miners, I mentioned that. And, as I said, EV firms directly investing. So again, just to give a taste of what this looks like, it's a really useful chart from the Financial Times on the left. This is just one of 6 pages. So there are 6 equivalent pages of this list. I just, can only show you so much. But it gives you a sense of all of the new types of financial arrangements between auto companies and mining companies, the most novel of which is auto companies directly investing in mines, which in a way, and many commentators have said this, harkens back to our era of Fordism and vertical integration from the late 19th and early 20th century, when, for example, Henry Ford invested directly in steel plants, in iron mines, in rubber, right? And so we see an almost, return to that vertical integration, but in this totally new political economic moment. The most recent news on this front is from a couple of weeks ago. GM, the big auto company, made headlines directly investing $650 million in equity stakes in the Thacker Pass project in Nevada. That project at the time of this investment was actually in federal court with a court case from environmental, indigenous, and rancher groups. It's since the court has made its decision, allowing it to move forward, but holding back part of the mining plan. So it's a little bit confusing, how the mine will move forward, but that's in the sort of administrative state right now of the US. But while this sort of court case was happening, GM invested an enormous sum of money directly into the mine, which then, of course, sent Lithium America's stocks soaring. And you sort of see, again, how this financial coordination is taking place across supply chains. The last thing I'll note on the green capitalist front for now is that, similar to states, there's an increasing emphasis on, quote, sustainable sourcing, right? Some of this, or maybe all of this, depending on your perspective, could be greenwashing. But I do think it's interesting that auto companies and mining firms are investing more and more money in, at the very least, rhetoric, if not in some cases new forms of certification, et cetera, in trying to prove to consumers as well as ESG investors their green and ethical bona fides. So that's a kind of development on the sustainability front. now I want to kind of bring these two pieces into interaction, right? How are government and corporate strategies connected to one another? And maybe most interestingly, where are the tension points between this public policy drive to onshore mining in competition with China, on the one hand, and a profit-driven global kind of capitalist firms, right? You know, one potential point of tension, and there's examples of this emerging, is that this drive in the US government and European governments to decouple from China might be a tough pill to swallow for firms that are used to sprawling supply chains and chasing the cheapest inputs, right? And so there's some logistical and economic cost to kind of reshoring production, starting with mining and across the supply chain. The other is on the sustainability front, where, you know, surprise, surprise, firms like to look green and ethical, but they don't want to be forced with regulation to be green and ethical, right? And I'm happy to speak to examples of where this tension point has come up, especially in Europe, where the EU has made many more strides in trying to actually regulate firms on this front. There's also tensions within the state that I think are interesting, and I think will feel familiar in Canada, where on the one hand, this emphasis on responsible mining in the global north, and sustainability and our governance structures are so robust. On the other hand, this increasing drive in the US and the EU to fast track mining, right? Which actually makes the governance less robust, right? So which is actually the priority? Is it sustainability or is it speed? I think, you know, this is a whole set of interesting kind of interlocking incentives around security, sustainability, and profitability, right? And it's kind of in this domain of tensions amidst these rapidly expanding supply chains that, you know, something that I think we can call green capitalism, meaning capitalism where these green sectors become really important sites of both accumulation as well as geopolitical and class conflict is being forged, right? So I think these dynamics between states and firms are really interesting to look at. But I don't want to make it sound like elite actors are the only ones that are relevant in shaping these supply chains, which is not true. In fact, you know, part of what drew me to this topic was when I went to Chile in early 2019, there had already been years of episodes of protests against lithium for the ways that it was harming the local environment and for the fact that lithium mining companies had not consulted, let alone gotten the consent of indigenous peoples that live around that salt flat, right? So just like other mining sectors, we see protests at the sites of lithium extraction. And the way that states are seeking to onshore supply chains is not eliminating protest. Instead, it's expanding where protest takes place. So while we previously, you know, in a prior era, saw mainly protests in Chile and Argentina around lithium, now we see protests erupting in the US and in the European Union and in Serbia and elsewhere as the kind of lithium frontier mutates and moves around the world. Just to give you a sense of what some of this protest looks like, these are some snapshots from some of the more intense protests. As I said, on the upper right, protesters managed to block Rio Tinto's contract for now, at least in Serbia, though, again, there's fears that it might come back once there's a change of government. In Portugal, there have been efforts to stall this mining project in northern Portugal that has actually been successful, meaning that it has been sort of delayed, and there's been new environmental requirements put on the mining company. There's been protests in Chile, as I mentioned. In Nevada, there was a long-term protest camp and that lawsuit that I also just mentioned. A few more images from my more recent fieldwork from the past year to give us a sense of the specific landscapes that will be affected in Portugal and Nevada, and also how kind of place-based and in defense of local land and water and livelihoods, this protest is kind of framed and organized. You know, so as I already mentioned, the reason that I think we should attend to social movements, aside from political or social justice commitments, is that they are also having an impact in the map or the territoriality of extraction. They are successfully slowing down processes, or in some cases, stalling projects. They may, as has been the case in other extractive sectors like copper, make certain projects just unviable by scaring off investors. You know, but I think they're interesting for another reason, which is that we see increasing transnational coordination among protesters across the global north and south. So just like the global north is governments are incentivizing mining within their borders, we see activists in the global north, thinking kind of about the sector and interacting with comrades in the global south, right? So it's a really interesting dynamic that is itself both reflective of changing supply chain, the changing territories of supply chains, but also is in turn reshaping where mining might be viable or not viable. We see a lot of interesting and innovative ideas. A lot of them come from the global south and specifically Latin America, but are being now kind of amplified by activists in the global north as well. So ideas about rights of nature, indigenous consent, moratoria or no-go zones, nationalization, is a major demand in Latin America, focus on labor rights and the experience of workers at these mines. So these are shared frames that kind of move across borders as activists talk to one another and kind of share strategic insights. But I think, the final point on our sort of, the onshoring front is that what we see from activists in the global north is a rejection of the idea that mining is inherently more responsible in the US or Europe or Canada. And we can talk about that. I have different thoughts on it, but I think that we are definitely seeing that frontline communities don't automatically accept that mining is more responsible just because it takes place within the global north. And I'm almost done here. I'm in my second to last slide. So thanks for bearing with me. But, I want to bring it full circle and think about how supply chains are shaped and think about how mining demand is and the process of mining is so affected by decisions that happen all the way at the other end of the supply chain. So as I mentioned early on in this talk, the main driver for demand for new lithium, which means for new lithium mines, is the auto industry, really. It's the electric vehicle manufacturing, and specifically passenger electric vehicles are the largest bucket of that demand, right? And so, I think there's a lot of different policy suggestions and proposals that can help make help make the energy transition more just in terms of the resource extraction that it requires. One set of proposals that I'm super happy to talk about and I think are very important are how land and nature and mining is governed on the kind of front lines of extraction, right? So that's at the very beginning of supply chains. But I think something that doesn't always get enough attention is that what happens at the beginning of the supply chain is dramatically shaped by decisions at the other end of the supply chain, right? How many EVs are actually being produced? How are those EVs being incentivized as the sort of main and primary panacea of, confronting the climate crisis by governments, right? What are those decisions that are made at the other end of the supply chain that affect how much lithium is demanded in the first place? And so I'll kind of close out, and I know this is, it's a slide that's kind of doing a lot and saying a lot to you at once, so I'll kind of summarize it briefly. As was mentioned in the very warm introduction, I recently led and co-authored a new report called Achieving Zero Emissions with More Mobility and Less Mining. And we asked a question that hadn't really been asked before, or at least had not been studied with empirical data, which is there a way to get to zero emissions transportation for the US transportation sector, which is our most polluting sector in terms of carbon and the only major sector in the US where emissions are still rising, right? So it's extremely important to cut emissions from transportation. But is there a way to do so that doesn't involve the most alarming kind of predictions about how much mining would need to take place to furnish those electric vehicles? And the answer is yes, we can actually get to zero emissions with less mining than has been predicted by all of the forecasting agencies if we expand our vision of what mobility and electric mobility looks like, right? If we try to design a transportation sector that expands mass transit, that makes our streets more walkable and cyclable, that makes our cities and suburbs denser so they're easier to move around without a car, right? That also makes our batteries less gargantuan. Right now, the US average battery size is twice the global average and twice where it was a decade ago. So our batteries are getting huge with like the e-Hummer trend and the e-SUV trend. All of that, the car dependency of the US, the large battery sizes, the sprawl, all of that is why, you know, the lithium demand is so high, if even just looking at what the US transportation sector alone would need, not taking into account, you know, the rest of the world. And it turns out that we can really reduce how much lithium is needed if we think about expanding mobility at the same time that we reduce the resource intensity of a fully renewable and zero emissions transportation sector. So we have some interesting findings there. I'll just say one of them, and then I'll close out and we'll move to questions. Which is that if we zoom ahead to the year 2050, which is the last year that we modeled, we see a 92% difference between the worst and best case scenarios in terms of how much lithium they would require, right? So in our worst case scenarios, we continue to be car dependent. Our distances that we travel are very long. We have really high rates of car ownership. Our batteries continue to get, you know, supersized. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is we move to more normative battery sizes. We reduce vehicle ownership. We expand mass transit. We maximize recycling. That best case scenario needs 92% less lithium in the year 2050 than the worst case. And so, you know, I think that it's worth thinking about, you know, what is the whole spectrum of options for how we slash emissions from transportation, and what's the way to both maximize mobility, which is a right, and, you know, we should think about transit justice, at the same time that we cut emissions from this sector as the climate crisis demands of us, and at the same time that we reduce the harms associated from mining, which I think frontline groups are calling to, increasingly calling to our attention. So I'll end that there, and I'm excited to hear what folks want to talk about in the Q&A, and I'll get out of my screen share.
Thank you so much, Thea, and I hope you can hear some of that clapping. Unfortunately, our technology is not sophisticated enough for you to see the audience, but I can assure you we've got a full room here, and thank you so much for that fantastic talk. Just absolutely amazing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Naomi, co-director of the CCJ, and please join me in thanking our wonderful speaker, Thea Riofrancos.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thea, I just want to thank you so much for modeling I think the best kind of community engaged scholarship. As you were speaking, I was reminded of a caution offered many years ago by Arundhati Roy, the wonderful Indian novelist and analyst, who said, she cautioned against environmentalism that asks the question, how do we change without changing? And I think that what we have just heard from Thea is something very different. It's scholarship that asks the question, given that we must change, how do we change in ways that repair? How do we embrace a truly transformational kind of change, one that is unafraid to ask the really sticky questions about not just how do we switch from one input to another, but how do we actually address the underlying crises of overconsumption by the few and underconsumption by the many, if we look at this from a global perspective. So I really hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing collaboration between many of us in the room. I really want to thank Nadia and Jess for doing all the great organizing. It's such incredible student questions here, and I hope that this leads to lots more exciting research that begins with the questions that we really need answers for, and I think we can do incredible things together. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. And yeah, I did just want to thank everyone for being here. I think it's so great to see so many different faces from all around campus, which doesn't happen often enough. So I hope there's a lot more to come. And just thanks to Jess, Sarah, Samantha, and Jacob from the CCG for all the behind the scenes, to Carol, Philippe, Alison, and Scott as well. I just want to acknowledge our wonderful TAs who've been helping with the course, Prana, Cian, Reem, and Justin. And also to David, who's gone, but our incredible AV guy who made everything work, which is amazing because so often these things don't. So yeah, so thanks again, Thea. And And for the students in the class, we're going to let Thea have a breather for a little bit. We're going to reconvene at 3 o'clock, and we have a bit of more one-on-one with Thea to continue. So thanks everyone again. And look out for our next event within the Killam course, which will be happening on 1st of March. If anyone's interested, we'll be sharing details on that soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.